Welcome to AHA Math and Science. In today's video, we'd like to discuss whether the current trend of inflation is going down will continue, and also how inflation will look like down the road. So just to kind of get started, here is a chart of the consumer price index for all urban consumers, which is commonly known as CPI-U. Over the past 100 years, actually more than 100 years, starts from January of 1914. So back then, the CPI-U index value is around 10. And, I guess a lot of guys maybe even do not know that at that time, a loaf of bread was just around like 7 cents. So what about now? Well, the very recent reading of CPI-U index for March 2023 was just kind of released this week. So the reading stands at 301.8. And just kind of a side note, a loaf of bread currently is probably around $3. You can see that actually the CPI-U had about like 30-fold increase from like more than 100 years ago. And in fact, the price of bread kind of corresponds to this CPI-U index. So really, this kind of uptrend tells us that everything's kind of getting expensive, over time. But it's kind of hard to actually make sense of the inflation out of this curve because a lot of information is really kind of hidden. So now, in order to get a better idea of exactly what is inflation, is doing, what kind of pattern, let's take a look at actually the annual rate of CPI-U. And that is basically kind of compare the CPI-U index from now to like a year ago. So that's the annual change. So in percent, this is what actually commonly known as inflation. So you can see this inflation rate kind of ranges from more than 15% during this kind of hyperinflation period to actually a negative like 10, negative 15% during kind of deflationary or like even sometimes recession or depression, times. And this pink curve is 2%, which is kind of the target set by the Federal Reserve. So if you look closely at this data, so just kind of ignore this data in the first 10 years during the 1910s, you can see the rest of data can be kind of grouped into more or less kind of three huge cycles, which I will now call it inflation super cycles. So the first super cycle kind of starts around 1920 and ends around like 1965, with a peak inflation around 1947. And then we have the next super cycle kind of starts from 1965 and it ends around basically the recent kind of great recession, 2010. So that's the second super cycle with a peak inflation around like 1980. You can see in each of these sort of inflation super cycles, there's these small cycles. The first one, you can see there's a clear small cycle, another small cycle, another small cycle, another small cycle. So during the rising of the inflation, you can see clearly the four small cycles. And the same thing happens for this next super cycle. You have this initial kind of a small inflation cycle, next cycle, next small cycle, then the inflation kind of peaked. In addition, you can also see that, the top inflation of each small cycle is rising, but the bottom is also rising. You can clearly see that. So this is the lowest bottom, and then the lower inflation for each cycle is kind of going up. So kind of making higher lows, using kind of the jargon in the stock market. And then the same thing happens for this next super cycle. What about the present time? You can see that we kind of already see one small cycle, and then this is kind of second small cycle. Let's kind of draw it. There's a small cycle here. There's another cycle. We're kind of in the middle of the second cycle. In addition, you can also see it's kind of making high lows, the inflation. This is kind of lowest inflation, which is during the Great Recession, 2009. And So we kind of believe that this is indeed kind of the start of a third inflation super cycle. So this is kind of the general envelope for this inflation super cycle. So therefore, we kind of expect this second cycle is going to continue and then end and then start a third cycle. So, and it's going to probably kind of stop by this trend line here. This puts us for this current cycle, the low of the inflation will be probably around 3%, which is a peak reached in 2015, 2016, which is really kind of still above the Federal Reserve target. And then the inflation probably kind of go back up and kind of finish the start of the third cycle. So what about the time frame? Well, the time frame, if you look at the first two super cycles, it's each is around like 45 years. So we probably kind of really kind of guesstimate. This one probably is starting from 2010 to somewhere around like 2055. But it's really kind of hard to know exactly the time frame, and even harder to actually guess when the peak inflation will appear. This is because you can see for each super cycle, it's not symmetrical. So sometimes the front end is longer than the back end. Sometimes the back end is actually longer than front end. So it's hard to kind of guess when the inflation will peak. So next, let's really kind of ask ourselves, like, why you have this inflation super cycle? What is the kind of underlying reason? So we all know kind of inflation really come from basically kind of the imbalance between supply and demand. So when demand for goods and services kind of exceed the supply for goods and services, then the price will go up. So certainly kind of scarcity of resources will play a role in inflation, but I think like the main sort of driver for inflation is really population. So because it's people actually produce goods and service, and it's people actually that demand goods and service. So the underlying problem is what? People. So now we can actually take a look at the population growth in the US from 1900 to the present time. You can see that. Let's first actually mark the peak inflation. One is at 1947 for the first super cycle. The next one is at 1980 for the second super cycle. You can see before each of these peak inflation, long before that, you can already see the inflation growth rate start to decline. So from like 2% to here, it's like around 0.6%. And then same thing happens for the next super cycle, the inflation already kind of decline, and then it kind of hits this bottom here, and then stabilize. And so there's a delay basically from when the growth rate kind of bottoms to when you have a peak inflation. For the first super cycle, it's about 15 to 20 years. For the next super cycle, it's about 10 to 15 years. So one may kind of speculate why you have this kind of pattern here. Well, one kind of hypothesis could be that, as you have like a decline in the population growth rate, so eventually it's going to reflect in basically the tightness on the supply side of goods and services, because would be less kind of workforce, providing or producing, goods and services. So that could be one of the reasons. And then, you can see that for the current time, we already kind of have this population growth rate declining since like the end of last century for like more than 20 years. In fact, just in 2020, we have the lowest annual growth rate since at least 1900. So that's already kind of a trend, very similar to what we have seen before in the previous two super cycles. So if history is any guide, and you can see there's a delay from the population growth bottoms, so to when the peak inflation appears. So now if we have, I guess like if suppose that in the population growth rate is going to kind of stabilize at here, then it's probably take another 15, 20 years for the inflation to peak. So this is where we kind of like really kind of a wild guess that this might be kind of the time when we see the inflation kind of peak during this third inflation super cycle. Our guess is probably somewhere around like 2035. This is really just a guesstimate. So when I actually doing this analysis, producing this video, I was really kind of surprised to find this strong correlation between the population growth and the peak inflation, and also actually the very clear sort of inflation super cycles in the past 100 years. And we seems like to be in this third sort of inflation super cycle. So I guess like I hope this video just kind of serves as a starting point for a discussion on this topic. So please feel free to leave your thoughts, and discussions below in the comment section. And again, your support really kind of means a lot to this channel. And so please do not forget to click the like button and also subscribe to our channel. And thank you very much for watching.